Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you could tell from the title, I am finally tackling the Star Trek film that I skipped earlier when I reviewed the unofficial trilogy 2 through 4, and that is 1979's Star Trek The Motion Picture. Now, from what I've gathered from reading comments from fellow film and Star Trek fans over the years, this seems to be one of the entries in the series that you like it or you don't. Because I've seen there are people that don't really like it because of how slow it is, and then there are people that like it for that reason. I have to say, I liked it. I'd say the following three films, in my humble opinion, are better overall, but I liked it. And this was the vibe I got, not even that far into the film, but it definitely feels like a feature length, big budget version of an episode of the original series. And I have a feeling that's what they were going for. The main question there, of course, is whether that is what Star Trek fans wanted or were expecting at the time, which is a question that only people who were fans of Star Trek during the original run and in the decade in between the end of the series and this film will be able to answer. If you fall into that category, please put your 2 cents in the comments section. Me, of course, being born 10 years after this film, it would have been a different situation. And it's the situation I find myself in now, where I'm watching all this with the benefit of hindsight. And, like I said, the next three films are better, but this is a pretty good first attempt at it. And if you look at it in another way, it's the third year in a row we got an excellent sci-fi film. 1977, we got Star Wars, changed the face of cinema forever, even though that film was a reinvention of the old space opera serial format that we saw with film serials like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, but it took all that stuff and made it feel fresh and new. Just how the year after that, Alien from Ridley Scott took the dark house formula with a little bit of the proto slasher formula from the 70s and made them feel fresh and new by setting it in space. And of course, this film, while it doesn't feel as fresh and new compared to those two, it definitely is an experience film. This is one of those films that if I ever did have a chance to see it on the big screen, I would, because seeing a lot of these special effects on the big screen would be good. It was produced for a budget of approximately $35 million, which nowadays is a medium-sized budget, but back then that was a pretty good-sized budget, and you can definitely tell that all that money, or a good amount of it, is up on the screen, because the special effects, ooh, they look beautiful. Now, some of the special effects work does lead to some parts of the film feeling a little slow-paced, to where I guess some people call it the slow motion picture, and the comparisons to 2001, especially with the ending of the film, you can definitely see why they're there. But I'd say that 2001 definitely feels slower paced, whereas here the slow pace feels like it's going for a discovery, as in following the motto of Starfleet and their whole creed of seeking out new life forms, going where no man has gone before. Anyway, 35 million budget, and it made 82 million in late 70s money. Now, when you go by Hollywood accounting, that would mean it barely made a profit. If you don't remember my Hollywood accounting thing, by Hollywood accounting practices, you have to make double your budget to break even. Think that. Double your budget to break even. I don't know how it is that they arrange their books to where that's the case, but that's what it is. So, $35 million budget, you'd have to make $70 million in order to break even, which $82 million they did, so they made a $12 million budget. Better to be in black ink than red ink, but that's not what they thought they were going to get, which is why I think it took a couple years for us to get Wrath of Khan, and for them to go back to the drawing board and like, we got to rethink all this. Because I have a feeling that if Wrath of Khan, construction-wise, and how everything was set, was more like this film, we might not have gotten more than 2 Star Trek films. It's one of those big what-ifs. Which, of course, as I've said before, the 2 most dangerous words in any language. What if? The director was Robert Wise. He has a bunch of other excellent films under his belt. This is one of his last films, of course. Early on, he directed The Body Snatcher, a great film that was led by Boris Karloff. Got a review of it up on the page, and also a review of its source material if you want to see. Shameless plug. The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original. Still haven't watched it. West Side Story, haven't seen it in a while, but I remember liking it. It's a film that we studied in musical theater. And of course, another musical, The Sound of Music, which I have never seen. Screenplay was written by Harold Livingston. He was more a TV writer, known for writing Mission Impossible episodes along with Fantasy Island. It's kind of ironic considering who's in the next film. Now, you can kind of tell a little bit that he was mainly a TV writer with how certain bits of dialogue are written. Because if that's part of the weakness of the film, it's some of the dialogue. And part of this is comparing it to how the next films are written. But also part of it is looking at it as like, with how this dialogue is, this would be alright for TV, but for a theatrical film, it's like, And part of it also goes with how the characters are presented, which I will get to that in a little bit, but it's like, yeah, it definitely has that TV vibe there. Which makes me wonder why the person who came up with the story in the first place did not write the screenplay, and that was Alan Dean Foster. He's known for writing a lot of novelizations. He wrote a lot of the Star Wars novelizations. I believe he has some Star Trek novels under his belt, but he also wrote the first 3 novelizations of the Alien films, which I got over on that shelf somewhere, which, yes, he even wrote Alien 3, even though he protested a lot of the creative decisions in that film, which whenever I retackle that novelization, I'll talk about that. Wait, what's the plot, if you haven't... Anyway, the plot of the film is it takes place several years after the end of the original series. 5, if memory serves right. They never really state it on screen. Captain Kirk is no longer on the Enterprise. He has been promoted to Admiral in the interim, which they don't really bring up a lot. They never call him Admiral other than like Admiral Kirk. It's not like the next couple films where it's like, Admiral, we are approaching the thing. And they call him by his title of captain, not by his rank of captain whenever they address him throughout the film. Kirk has been dying to get back on the Enterprise since he was promoted, which this is the, I guess you could say with that, it's the beginning of the character arc that would take him through to the end of Star Trek 4, which is where him wanting to be on a ship again. Him being an admiral is a waste of his greatest talent, which is commanding a starship. They don't really, like I said, they don't really touch on it. The reason Kirk gets on it is because there is a danger approaching Earth's solar system. It's this gigantic, massive energy. It attacks some Klingons, which is the only time we see them in this film, and it's the debut of their redesign with the ridges, which I'll get to later. And they are the only starship in the quadrant, which seems to be a very common trope with this, and it's one that I haven't watched every episode of the original series, so I don't know how often they played it there. But throughout the film series, it seems to be one where it goes, oh, the only one. You don't say. Here they only mention it in passing, and considering that the Enterprise had just finished a refit and they have Kirk, it's one of those ones that even if they weren't, I could see Starfleet going, alright, we're going to send Kirk. They end up going. Kirk, of course, enlists the services of all of his old crew. Some of them, just by happenstance, happen to be on the Enterprise under the command of the then Captain, soon to be demoted to First Officer, Captain Deckard. But, of course, other ones he has to find later. He finds Spock along the way, because Spock was off doing Vulcan remove emotion stuff, which failed. And Bones was off trying to enjoy retirement, looks like in a disco revival, based on what he was wearing when he's shoehorned onto the ship. But the crew, they work together, they make their way towards the anomaly, and they discover it is the remnant of the Voyager program. In real life, we only launched 2 Voyager ones, and of course, one of them has just entered interstellar space a couple months after this is recorded, so nice. Now here, in the timeline of this movie, they launched 6. And Voyager 6, which is the one that Voyager, as it calls itself, spawned from, was launched in the late 20th century. I'm guessing by the timeline presented before would have been around the time of the eugenics wars, maybe a little bit afterwards. So it makes you wonder why they sent him in there, maybe to find stuff following that war. Well, it has become self-aware and wants to fulfill its programming by talking with its creators, i.e. humans on Earth. And it's one of those instances where at first it's like, we don't know anything, so they try to communicate with it. And it leads to a weird little thing at the end, which I'm not going to spoil for those who haven't seen the film. But let's just say that it being weird but an interesting idea, which seems to be a thing with Star Trek, is that you have interesting ideas that have a little bit of weirdness to them, but they seem to go and fit with Roddenberry's vision, or the vision of whoever is leading the show at the time, post his passing. The studio clashed with Roddenberry over this ending, because they found the whole thing with the machine and what happened with it too far-fetched, which to a point you can understand, because even though this is science fiction, Star Trek tries to at least be semi-realistic with how it presents stuff, unlike Star Wars, which is more like space fantasy with some sci-fi trimmings in there. And also a little bit more than Alien, because some of that is a little bit of that fantasy stuff, even though it does go from a scientific perspective. So, who in the end eventually convinced the Paramount executives to let Roddenberry put that idea in the finished film? Sci-fi author Isaac Asimov. Famous, he was very famous at this point, so they sent him the idea. He loved it. He only included some minor changes in other parts of the film, and that was mainly from a terminology standpoint. It's like, instead of a wormhole, you should probably call this something else. But you can kind of understand, because even since then, a lot of our theoretical understanding of the science of deep space has changed. It's one of those constant changing things. The more we see from deep space with probes and telescopes and all that, and until we actually develop interstellar space travel to the point where we can send humans out into space and start examining this stuff and send data back, a lot of it's going to be theoretical. It's mainly going to be the closer to home stuff that's going to be easier to actually show is a rule and not a guideline. It's always the interesting thing with science. The acting all around is pretty decent. The original crew, y'all definitely believe these are the characters from the original series, just a couple years older. But like I said a little bit in passing, there is a little bit of, I don't know if I'd use the word awkwardness, but it borders on that with them. And that comes down to the writing. Like I said, it definitely feels like it would be more at home on TV. But also, it feels like it plays it a little bit too safe. Like, this is an episode of the show where it presents an interesting idea, but you don't see a lot of conflict outside that idea. Not a lot that changes the characters. They feel a little stagnant, which I know is an issue that fans of the original series and fans of the next series would complain about. I mean, they even addressed this on Deep Space Nine by changing stuff after a bit, and with Voyager even. They had a little bit of complaint there. It's just that it makes it to where you don't feel the actors have a lot to work with, and it's like, it's just there. And this is the point of view even Nimoy had. I have a couple quotes from him here that I'm going to read. The first one doesn't say a year, but this is what he had to say. It was a very finely crafted film, and it did well. But from the actor's point of view, frankly, it was frustrating. We didn't feel that we were getting to play the characters we enjoyed playing in the way that we knew how to play them. So they were there, but just not much to do with the characters other than playing the way that they were told to. And this is one he said in 2012. It just wasn't a Star Trek movie. We had the Star Trek people, but it didn't use us as a Star Trek characters very well. I think that also touches on the more later viewpoint that this doesn't really feel like a Star Trek film, even though I disagree with that, as you've probably already seen. And that's probably also coming through the lens of how the next couple films were, especially since Nimoy directed 2 of the next 3 films. But it's just like, it plays it too safe, not a lot done characterization-wise, that it just feels like the actors are going through the motions playing those characters. Now, back to the Klingons. As I mentioned in passing before, this is the debut of the ridged forehead version. Now, at this point in time, the whole statement about that was, this is how they've always looked. All Klingons have always looked like this, even in the original series. For that, we did not have the budget in order to present them this way. So whenever you see them in that series, imagine that they're looking like this. Now, in later series, more so Deep Space Nine, that would be retcon to where we would see there actually is an in-universe explanation for the non-ridges, which we wouldn't get the direct answer for why until Enterprise. And one comment I've seen in the YouTube videos involving that episode of Deep Space Nine point out that it would have been fun to just see Michael Dorn in the classic makeup and have none of them address it. That would have been fun, but I think they went with that because actually addressing it on camera in a loosey-goosey way it also makes fun, especially with the way Dorn acts it, where you could tell he's trying to avoid giving a full answer. They are Klingons, and there is a long story. We do not discuss it with outsiders. Here, that debut, the makeup looks pretty good on them. It is a little rough compared to how it looks the next time we see them in Part 3, and then, of course, in Part 4, and even in the subsequent series. But the idea is there, and I do like the look of the captain. He is a little brutish, a little animalistic. And to go with that, this is also the debut of Klingonese as an actual language instead of just being mentioned in passing. And who's the one that came up with that language? None other than James Doohan, Scotty himself. He came up with that. And then for Part 3, linguist Mark Orkland elaborated on the language using what we heard in this film and created grammar and syntax for it, so even these words made sense retroactively. And of course, Scotty himself was not done with that because he also devised the Vulcan words in the scene involving Spock and the other Vulcans to match their lip flaps when they decided they shouldn't be speaking English. Of course, they also had to change the subtitles to make this less obvious, but it's like you did double duty linguistically there. Whereas subsequent Star Trek films would work the crew of the Enterprise aging into the plot with little subtle jabs and humor every now and then, especially in the second film with Kirk getting the glasses. This film does everything in its power to hide that. There was special lighting used on the crew, and one thing, of course, I also noticed is Scotty has darker hair in this film, so I don't know if he dyed it prior to it or that's part of the lighting. They use camera tricks to hide it, and it's only noticeable subtly, but the lighting is definitely noticeable in a lot of scenes. Although it does kind of go with the whole feature-length episode motif I mentioned earlier. Shatner himself went on a near starvation diet, and he actually does look pretty good in this film, size-wise. Of course, he didn't do it for the subsequent films, but if you're going to work on the aging thing, it would make sense Kirk would be a little heftier, especially if he's an admiral and has been for a couple of years. This being a few years after the original series, it would make sense that Kirk is still a little trim, but maybe a little heftier than he was before. And with that, storyline-wise, it makes sense that you would do this for the crew. Make them look like they're older, but not that much older. And it's one of those things that people always do get sensitive about their age, especially if your genetics make you age at a normal rate or age faster. Me, on the other hand, I got the reverse issue. People always are assuming I'm 5 to 7 years younger than what I am. 31. People always guess 25. And again, it's one of those things you just take it as a compliment. But even then, I get where they were coming from with this, where it's a very sensitive subject. More so back then, but especially also in Hollywood. And going with this was the fact that the cast and crew hated the new uniforms. This is the only time we see those uniforms. And it's one of those things, if you're watching Star Trek, every time they change the uniforms, you take a drink. And let's think about it. We have the uniforms in the original series. We have these ones. We have the red tunics, which are still one of my favorite. We have the Next Generation era ones. We have their slight redesign for Deep Space Nine. We had the ones that they did for Generations that were never actually used. We have the next redesign that was used for the rest of Deep Space Nine, where they switched the color of the uniform to the inside, and the outside it's all gray on the shoulders. And we had the redesign of the original ones for the newer Kelvin timeline films. You got the Discovery uniforms. And of course you got the dress uniforms. So many uniforms. These ones, there are times where they look nice, but then there are times where I'm like, I don't believe these as uniforms. Maybe it's the lighting, maybe it's the design, but it's like, I really wish they would have just stuck and used the ones that they used in the previous film and just update the design a little bit. Would that have been so much to ask? The only one I really like is the one that Kirk is wearing when we first see him, but when he's actually on the Enterprise after that, I'm like, I don't like this. Now, there are other costumes I do like what Spock's wearing when we first see him, what the other Vulcans are wearing, what the Klingons are wearing, what the security team is wearing. But it's one of those things like that once we get to the next film, it's like, oh, thank goodness for the red tunics. Because those are the uniforms of a Federation Starfleet. The excellent score for this film was composed by Jerry Goldsmith, legendary composer, and a little tie-in with the 3 year in a row thing, considering he did the score for Alien as well. And this is an epic score. It is the definition of space adventure, exploration, and discovery. And of course, that main theme was reused later as the opening theme for Star Trek The Next Generation, so it would live on. Why they didn't use it in the subsequent films at all, I don't know. They just used a new score, which is still just as good. But it's this one, it's like, it makes you wish that this was the theme for the next film and that theme was the theme for this one. But it is a good one. And a little bit of trivia about it is that main theme almost never happened. Because when Goldsmith was doing his initial score, the first scene he did was the flyover of the Enterprise, which, as an aside, is one of the long moments I don't have an issue with, because it's the first time we've seen the Enterprise since the cancellation of the show, so I don't begrudge the filmmakers deciding to linger on it and make that shot long, especially since it cuts back to Scotty and Kirk looking at it like, hello, old friend, I'm Batgirl. And for us, it's like, we're back at the Enterprise, everyone. Now back onto it. Robert Wise liked the score, but he rejected it as the movie lacked a theme/motif. Jerry Goldsmith went back to the drawing board, and here we are. And of course, variations of that main theme we hear throughout it, like that scene I just mentioned. There is a variation of it, and in that scene, that score does build. It starts soft, then by the time we see the front of the Enterprise, it builds. It's more bombastic. Not as bombastic as in the overture or even the beginning of the credits, but it is more bombastic in comparison. And throughout the rest of the film, the score does fit the tone very well. It's one of those ones that I actually want to get a copy of the score and listen to it independently just to see how the music feels on its own, because it definitely feels like one of those scores that just listening to it independently of the pictures, you still get that same sense of awe. Now for some random trivia. A lot of the scenes on the bridge, the dialogue had to be dubbed in post, and the reason is that for the monitors, they had to use projectors in order to get the images on them, because of the technology of the time, obviously. And those projectors were pretty loud. I would actually love to hear the post-dubbing audio just to see how loud that stuff was. I could go on forever with the trivia for this film, but of note, one thing I found interesting was that this film was the basis for McDonald's first movie-based Happy Meal campaign, which I can tie back to Star Wars in an interesting way. Think about it. Star Wars made a lot of money at the box office, but made a lot of money with merchandising, and it showed Hollywood the marketing potential of merchandise and tie-ins. Now, it wouldn't be until E.T. where product placement really became a thing, but considering the fact that Star Wars was aimed at kids, at least from a marketing standpoint, Alien not so much, but Star Trek, with its TV popularity and fan base, it's like, it's one of those things you look at like, we're bringing back Star Trek, it's going to make a lot of money, the post going out, of course. It's like, ooh, how can we tie it in? Ooh, kids love Star Trek. Let's put it in the Happy Meal. They'll be happy. So you can see where the wheels turn and why they would do that. And it's been a thing ever since. I can think of tons of movies that I saw just as a kid myself that they had Happy Meal tied in. Batman Returns, even though the parents complained about that one. Hercules. I believe I got every single toy from that one. In conclusion, Star Trek the Motion Picture is a pretty good, entertaining film. While it doesn't have the same amount of characterization as its successor films, and it has enough drama and thematic resonance to keep one entertained and engaged. If you're a Star Trek fan of any level, you should be able to stick through it. If not, that's what the fast forward button's for. If there's anything else to say, I really do hope Paramount gets off their butt and releases the director's cut on Blu-ray. I mean, I got the VHS of the director's cut up there somewhere, but I watched the Hulu version, so it was a theatrical cut, complete with 82 AUs instead of 2 to 4, like they changed it to.